Hello, everybody. My name is Ebony Uamaki. I am a mother to 4 beautiful children. I'm also completely blind. My work is based in intuitive reading, coaching, and speaking. I'm also a model for an inclusive talent agency, as well as an advocate for Guide Dogs Queensland. My podcast is called Ebb and Flow. It is centered around self-growth and healing, and really centered around allowing each person to see themselves in some respect in the episodes, just through hearing different people's stories and how they've been able to overcome their challenges and move through those uncomfortabilities of life in order to grow, thrive, and be the best versions of themselves.
Hello, I'm John Kuturillo, the life coach of your listener and host of the podcast of the same name. As a life coach, I combine evidence-based strategies with a wealth of personal and professional experience to comprehensively help people to learn about their minds and make the change that they desire in life. And in doing so, I work to combine the best aspects of traditional psychotherapy with contemporary helping professions while addressing the limitations of both. And on my program, I discuss social science and critical thinking. Welcome to this collaboration between the Ebb and Flow podcast and the Your Listener podcast. Today we'll be comparing a Western scientific perspective on the world with a spiritual perspective on the world and using specific examples of practices to highlight those differences and also the similarities. Now, before we begin, the world can be a rather polarising place, and we're not looking to denigrate any one worldview or dictate to anyone what they should or shouldn't believe. Ebony and I are entering into this discussion in good faith because we're both curious about objective reality, how the world works, how people's minds work, and we're here to compare the facets of each of the ideas that we use in our daily practices and which we hold to be true. We're not looking to dictate to anyone that they should change their beliefs or to denigrate any individual because of what they believe. This is to instigate critical thinking. This is to expose you to perspectives so that you can take that information and then do what you will with it. Please also remember that what you see on the internet is not advice. If you have any concerns about your life, whether it be with regard to your mental health, your physical health, or anything, please seek a professional's advice. Please do not take what you see on the internet as advice. Ebony, if we were to sensationalize this, we could very much call it a debate between a skeptic and a spiritualist. And if the audience hears it that way, they might assume that that's a very adversarial title, but a discussion between two people of fundamentally different worldviews doesn't have to be adversarial, does it?
No, not at all. I think that we can both give our individual perspectives, and I think sometimes too, when you allow each person to give their individual perspectives, you can also learn other ways of learning and doing things as well. So I think we can come together in harmony too.
To keep the audience informed, neither Ebony nor I have actually previewed what we're going to talk about in terms of each other's perspectives. This is completely honest dialogue. There is absolutely no trickery here. Ebony, I know there's a lot of misconceptions about spirituality, so would you like to explain what your own spiritual practices are and what they mean?
I have thought about the term spiritualist, and yes, a lot of the practices that I do in my work and a lot of the practices that I do in my everyday life are of the spiritualist realm, but I probably more describe myself as an experientialist. And what I mean by that is my belief systems and my faith and my moral compass is rooted in what I have experienced and what resonates with me in terms of like the practices that I use, like say meditation or, certain aspects of manifestation. I feel like those things have proven to work in my life and people that I have helped in my work. So that's where I come from. If they resonate with me, then they become a part of my belief system.
You're very much involved in your world and your environment, and you use what you've learned from your own experience as evidence to support what you do. So that allows you to, in your own personal life, filter what doesn't work and then strengthen what does work.
100%. And I guess the best way to describe it, and something that I've been thinking about a lot, is it doesn't matter what you believe in, whether your belief systems are rooted in spirituality or religion or you may be more scientific based or agnostic or atheist. We are all searching for purpose. And if I can say anything that's become very evident to me is that there's nothing outside of me that's going to give me purpose if I haven't searched for that within me. And so I think even though I use things like meditation or breath work, and those things resonate with me, they actually are things that are within me. They're things that I can utilize when I don't have anything around me.
What are some of the specific practices apart from meditation and manifestation that you use? Are there any that are perhaps common across the experiential or spiritual communities?
My work as an intuitive reader, that is something that I didn't sort out. I didn't go to school to learn that. I didn't seek a coach to learn that. I was actually surprised when I first realized that people studied how to be an intuitive or a psychic. So I would say in terms of the practices and belief systems that I share, that spiritualists share, that would definitely be one of them. But where I feel like my work varies is I don't depend on anything outside of me to be able to help me, I guess, harness my intuition. And what I mean by that is a lot of people within the spiritualist belief systems believe in spirit guides. They believe in astral planing and things of that nature. And those things are not things I in any way want to discredit, but they are not things that necessarily align with my belief system because I haven't had those experiences to back them up for me. And what I mean by that is when I do my work, it's more based on me going through my own meditative processes, grounding myself, getting into my own energy and feeling grounded within myself so then I can hone into other people's energies. So that would be where I think I share some like crossover of belief systems or practices, but I would say that they vary.
I've spoken to some other practitioners before who have mentioned similarities between intuitive practice and psychic practice. How would you explain each of these different phenomena?
In my belief system, we all have intuition, innate ability to be in tune. Also, I believe that the most powerful form of intuition that we have is an insight into our own lives. So if we don't have that first, then we really can't hold that space and hone in on other people's needs intuitively. I guess the best way to describe intuition is knowing something that may not be verbally communicated with you. So, for example, I will step into sessions with clients that I've never met, clients that I don't know anything about bar their name, and information will come through to me and I will pass it through to them. So when I say information comes through to me, I will see visions in my mind or feel experiences in my body, and it's almost like as I'm conveying these messages to my clients, they come out as a free flow conversation. So I will sit there for 45 minutes to an hour and just speak what comes through to me. So I guess I am more or less like a channel for that information, and I really try and focus on what's most important to the client. So it could be their past, it could be past trauma, it could be the present, it could be issues. I try not to focus too much on the future. If things do come up about the future, I'll mention them, but I feel more drawn to what needs to be changed in order to allow that individual to move forward. I think it's very individual. I think that if you are somebody that's doing your work as an intuitive or a psychic with the intention to truly help people, then I do believe that, the work comes from a place of harmony. It comes from a place of being grounded, but it also comes from a place of being able to walk your own talk and talk your own walk, because you cannot give advice that you cannot take. And so I think when it comes to the crossover between intuitive work and psychic work, I mean, I can't speak for every intuitive and every psychic. I can only speak for myself. Where I do feel like my work varies is that, like I said, I don't use any sort of external things to help me navigate that world. I don't use any pendulums or cards. I don't ask any questions. I purely just focus in on the energy that's coming through to me. And I base, I guess, my experience working in that realm on the fact that my clients can back up what I'm saying. The things that I'm saying are backed up by fact. So I think although it dips into the spiritualist world, it very much still is based on fact and what is being shown in the present.
Does that have to do with extrasensory perception, which is what I know the psychic phenomenon is based around?
I would say so. From the research that I've done into a scientific backing up of psychics and mediums and intuitives, from what I've seen, they've actually done a number of studies on pretty reputable psychics and mediums. And it's shown that, as they've scanned their brains while they have been doing readings, there's certain parts of their brains that actually switch off. So it shows that their brains go into this sort of like sleep mode. So it's very much reminiscent of a meditation, and they are honing in on something. They obviously can't be completely sure through the brain scan, but then obviously when it's backed up by the client saying, yes, that makes sense, yes, this is true, then obviously that's where the fact comes from. But I guess from the studies alone, it's definitely shown that when people are quote unquote channeling or in a reading session, that there are changes in the brain.
Would you say that the key utility of being able to intuitively read someone is to be able to communicate information to them that they may not be aware of?
No, I think that from my experience, it has nothing to do with me implanting anything into somebody that they are not already ready to hear. So, for example, I have done a number of readings with people that, perhaps are trauma survivors or perhaps are going through health issues, and I can pinpoint the exact health issue. I can pinpoint the exact challenge, and I can unpack that. I can go as far back as to where that challenge comes from or where that trauma comes from, and they can communicate to me that that is exactly what they've experienced or exactly how they felt. I've never really had an experience where somebody's just had an awakening through the session. It's always been something that they've already known, in my experience.
So would you say it's always been the case that when you're able to communicate an intuition that you have about someone to them, that what they do is confirm the information that you've communicated to them? It's never a case of them not being aware of it already?
100%. And that is almost 100% of the time. I'm not going to say 100% because I obviously am human and there is room for like error. And I think that's another thing that I feel like can be brought to the forefront, because there has been a lot of discredit, especially in the realm of spirituality, in the realm of intuitive readers and psychic readers, people trying to, I guess, discredit whether that is true, whether they are just a charlatan, so on and so forth. And that's definitely been something that I've struggled with, because as much as I do believe in the work that I do, I obviously am still human, and there is going to be days where I may not be feeling as great as other days, and I may need to, take a step back from my work and so on and so forth. But I say that all to say, all of the information that I've ever given to my clients has always been backed up and confirmed by them. And in my sessions, my clients rarely speak. So I know from other readings that I've observed, I haven't observed a lot, but from other readings that I've observed, they can often go in this sort of back and forth conversation between the reader and the client. I prefer not to talk to my clients before the session, because in my perspective that then cancels out the purpose of actually having a reading. The purpose of having a reading is to get confirmation and clarity from somebody that doesn't know anything about you. So I honestly just talk and talk and talk and just allow the messages to flow through me as if I'm having, the way that I explain it's like a therapy session, but I, one, am not a therapist, and two, you don't have to tell me anything. I'm just going to go wherever the energy goes and wherever I feel drawn to regarding your experience in your life, and then I will make sure that it makes sense to you, and then I will move on.
When you intuit information and the client confirms it, what do each of you then do with that information?
As the reader, when I'm giving the information, to have them confirm it just obviously confirms to me that what I'm being drawn to and what I'm touching on is of relevance to them, because it would be purposeless for them to come to a reading that was of no relevance to them. I also, as much as it is a spiritual practice, I'm also very rational and logical in my approach. And my purpose is to allow people to see the light that they see in others, in themselves. So for them, it's, I think, being validated. I think a lot of people struggle with being validated. And I think that's, I'm a big advocate for therapy, but I do feel like a lot of people struggle even with therapy because of the boundaries and limitations around therapy sessions at times. So what I've noticed being the most purposeful thing in sessions when people do get confirmation, how they take that information is they then feel that firstly they feel validated because they haven't had to share anything with somebody and they feel like somebody knows them, so it makes them feel seen and heard, it makes them feel comfortable, and then they're able to then apply that information into their lives in a tangible way to make, steps forward and make adaptations.
Do you think that the validation process actually strengthens the presence of the information, even though they already know it? Do you think it strengthens it in some way to empower that individual and encourages them to take action?
100%, because I feel like we all want validation. And I feel like as humans, it doesn't matter what walk of life we come from. And I've encountered many different human beings in my time, as I'm sure you have. I feel like all we want is connectedness, all we want is validation. And sometimes we go to different lengths to obtain that. But I feel like the validation piece of the reading really does help people to feel so comfortable, and the amount of times that people can then open up and say to me, this is the first time I felt seen and heard, or thank you for giving me space, thank you for validating me. I feel like that is such a powerful thing, and that is what makes the work that I do so purposeful.
Can you describe what the difference is between an intuitive reading and, say, traditional psychotherapy?
Some of the limitations in my perspective is when I am, say, doing an intuitive reading, it does allow me to connect with the person on a human level. And it also allows me to not only give them space to be seen and heard, but also help them to feel like they are not only coming to me as, a reader and as somebody separate from them, but then at times, if needed, I will give some, advice or perspective based on my own experience. I feel when it comes to traditional therapy, traditional psychotherapy, where the limitations can often be, in my perspective, around sometimes a disconnection between the client and the therapist in terms of that human connection, because obviously it needs to remain professional, but I feel like sometimes people are lacking so much connectedness in their own lives, they are seeking that in therapy as well, if that makes sense.
Do you think part of the reason that there's that disconnect is because the person has to explain themselves to the therapist, even though the therapist may fully understand what the person is describing?
I do. I feel like when you're opening up to somebody, I feel like you want to feel safe. You want to feel connected, and you want to feel like they see you more than just the surface. And I think that sometimes that can be the barrier. And a lot of the time, people, when they are stepping into therapy sessions, it may be the very first time they're divulging certain things, or they may not even know where to start. And I feel like the benefits that I've seen from my personal work is that I help them find that starting point without them having to verbalize, and give them that space, and then they can then take that on board. However, on the flip side, I will say what I've noticed that can be a barrier with my work is that then people can become too reliant on me and not want to do the work or rely on my intuition and the intuitive messages that I'm providing for them, opposed to taking ownership and putting that practice in their own lives. So I will say that there's barriers either way, and that would be the barrier in the work that I do. John, I was just wondering if you could, give me a little insight about your perspectives, your belief systems, and what has helped you navigate your world and your work.
So I work primarily from a perspective that combines Western science with some intuition, but mainly it's using Western science. A key concept is bias, and what bias is any factor that takes away from our ability to perceive objective reality. The basis of science is that it's meant to be the best means of discovering knowledge in the world and examining the world. What is meant to separate it from other types of practice is that it assumes that there is regularity in nature. That is to say, it assumes that the world has structures in it, that phenomena occur systematically. That is to say, they occur with purpose, and they occur because they're meant to occur for specific natural purposes. And the approaches are designed to eliminate bias, that is to say, eliminate any observations or conclusions that we draw that are based on only our own beliefs. It's meant to be that we draw conclusions on what is objectively observable, not necessarily what we believe. Because if we believe something, what can also happen is our internal experiences, our learnings, our teachings, which all have their own forms of bias, can influence the way that we observe phenomena and conclude on it. And so science has specific strategies in place that are designed to minimize that. One of the ways that we do it is by using empirical observation, which simply means we use the five senses, and we use the information that we gather from those sensory experiences as data, and then we interpret the data. Now, eliminating bias is never going to be possible because humans and the natural world are just far too complex. This is designed to minimize it by only using observation methods that have the least possible bias. It's not that they're unbiased, they just have the least possible bias. One of the other approaches that we take is we systematically study phenomena in a way that is meant to minimize the opportunity for bias to creep in. A good example of that is in medical studies. Not every medical study works this way, but this type of design is considered to be one of the strongest types of scientific design when studying phenomena such as medicine. A lot of us will see in television, on television and hear about in the media, prescription drug trials. And the way that prescription drug trials are ideally conducted is whoever wants to be a part of the study is randomly assigned to two groups. One person will be receiving the drug that's being tested. The other group will be receiving a placebo drug, that is to say a drug without the active ingredient, that it doesn't have the same chemical effects as the actual drug. Now, whoever administers the drugs to either of these groups doesn't know what drug they're administering. So any observation that the person conducting the experiment makes can't be based on their own knowledge of what the drug is because they actually themselves don't know. Doesn't mean they can't be biased, it just means that they can't draw any bias from knowledge of the drug. Ideally, what would actually happen is the person who administers the drug and then the person who takes the reports from the participants are actually different people, so there's even less chance for them to be biased. And then what we do is we observe the results using standardized instruments or measures, and then we compare the results, and we use special statistical methods to ensure that if there's a difference on average between what one group experiences and what the other group experiences, that the difference is actually large enough to represent an actual objective difference, not just random variance or chance. That's in a nutshell, but you can see there can be flaws to that.
And I did want to ask, as I was listening to that, I wanted to know where you felt like the flaws were and where you felt like the benefits were.
I believe the best way to live one's life is to be very attuned to one's bias and to be able to control for it. And there are a lot of procedures in science that allow us to attune for bias. In fact, science has actually been able to demonstrate to us that how bias works. It's been able to demonstrate what some of our biases are and just how powerful they are. In fact, they're quite frightening to the extent that often we're not even aware of how our mind's working. Our mind essentially works without our permission, and that's quite a frightening part. But being aware of it is really important because then we can make efforts to control for it. The main approach to that style of thinking that I find beneficial is that there are methods that can minimize bias. It gives us a better opportunity to see objective phenomena in the world for what they are without the influences of our emotions, which can be quite biasing. Not to say that they're not important, but they can be quite biasing in ways that ultimately aren't always in our best interests. The disadvantage of that, which I've found, is when you reduce everything to numbers, you are going to miss qualities in the world, because even though the numbers are designed to ensure against bias, which also ensures against corruption, and remember in scientific studies, people can directly corrupt the data for their own benefit. So the fewer chances people have to do that, the better the chance is that the results are going to be accurate and usable, because ultimately all this talk of objectivity is for the benefit of the human race. When you reduce everything to numbers, you can't adequately capture the richness that is nature. You have to observe quality and you have to examine quality. But the minute you take away that objectivity and you start making interpretations, bias gets introduced. And another disadvantage is it relies on something called reification. And in basic terms, I've discussed this before, but what it essentially means is we devise an abstract construct or an idea, and then we assume that's how the phenomenon actually takes place in the natural world. So an example of reification, when depression is treated in psychotherapy, one of the most common treatments for depression is cognitive behavioral therapy. And cognitive behavioral therapy reifies depression as resulting from a series of negative thoughts that influence a person's behavior, which then provides feedback to the person, and then the person then interprets that in a way that's not beneficial to them. Now, in order to use that theory, you need to essentially imagine that all those phenomena, negative thoughts, decisions, feedback, interpretations, are concrete, but they're not. They're abstract. They exist in the mind. We can't observe them with the senses. So we have to come up with ideas to represent them and then work with those ideas as if they're concrete. The problem is Mother Nature always knows more about herself than we know about her. So what we conceptualize as being concrete in science could be completely detached from what Mother Nature actually is, but it's the best we have, because the minute we start conceptualizing in ways that are too qualitative and too subjective, we might be biasing the way that we practice science in a way that we're actually unconsciously doing for our own best interests, not for society's best interests. I basically came to the conclusion that I can't be absolutely certain if either of these are objectively correct. I can't state that one is better than the other, because we need both objective judgment and some qualitative judgment. I have to live life being comfortable with not knowing something for certain, never stopping my examination. I always have to examine myself, the world, analyze information, and remove my emotions from it so that I don't limit how much information I take in. I take in all information, then I examine it and try to draw the best conclusions that I can, but I always have to be willing to re-examine phenomena in order to counteract for anything I might be missing by being too subjective or too objective. I have to be aware that no one's mind is immune from those biases.
I love the way you explain that. And my next question for you would be, when working with your clients in your life coaching work, where do you feel like those practices benefit the clients, and where do you feel like they can be flawed?
Sure. This is a good example of where science can have both its advantages and disadvantages. So I work from a number of different perspectives. I draw on tools that are from different modalities of psychotherapy, because I have evaluated using the evidence from my practice and my own experience of being mentally ill and overcoming the challenges associated with that combining these tools into a framework is quite a comprehensive explanation, as best as I can devise, for how the human mind functions. I'm always open to learning more, but this is the best explanation I've been able to devise so far. So one of the frameworks from which I work and which I draw tools is schema theory or schema therapy. And a schema is just a collection of ideas that guides how we perceive and interact with the world. And we develop schemas through learning experiences, and learning isn't necessarily explicit. We don't necessarily have to be told information in order to start interpreting it. We can learn it from just observing what happens in the world. One of the most important uses of schemas in the helping professions is in how they can cause a problem for someone. When somebody has a tendency in their life that is maladaptive, that is to say, that is actually taking away from their quality of life, for example, someone who self-sabotages, someone who's engaging in behaviours that are actually stopping them from achieving what they want, and then using those results as an excuse not to try harder, sometimes that can actually result because the person has developed schemes about the world that are not aiding them. Let's say that person had a difficult childhood. That person had been mistreated by their parents. They'd never been properly shown affection. They'd never been praised for anything good that they did. Even if their parents hypothetically never told them that they were bad, the fact that they only saw a lack of affection, which we are naturally designed to receive from people, like affection is a natural means of bonding between beings to create solidarity and survival. The fact that they didn't receive something that they were meant to, the fact that they never received validation, meant that they had no means of developing self-efficacy. That is to say, they had no means of developing a view of themselves and what their qualities were, because a lot of how we view our qualities is based on what people teach us and what we learn from the environment. So we're not born with this knowledge, and if that person grows up that way, because they didn't have those fundamental learning experiences, they had absolutely no way of judging their worth, and they had no way of looking at themselves and objectively asking, what is it about myself that is good and should remain so, and what is it about myself that I need to change? And the schema that develops from that is, I'm a bad person because no one showed me affection, which means that they must have had a reason not to show me affection. And because affection's a show of positivity, then the reason they didn't show me an affection was because I'm negative. That's also a manifestation of something called the just world fallacy, which is an assumption that when something good or bad happens to someone, it's because they deserve it, because they are a good or bad person. If that's the schema they've developed, then often that has a massive influence on all the different activities that they undertake in the world. If it's extreme enough, they make a mistake when cooking dinner, it's because they're horrible at everything. If they weren't as productive at work as they would have liked to have been, it's because they're incompetent. And their mind is completely affected. It's impeded in its ability to take in other information and then analyse that schema against the information to come to a conclusion about whether they really are a horrible person or whether circumstances acted on that situation and maybe prevented certain things from taking place. If I'm working with that tool, part of my job is to educate the client on why those schemas developed and the evolutionary history. Why are we like this? Why do we develop schemas? Why do we view the world this way? And then to offer them a challenge to use a particular problem-solving methodology to test their schemas. For example, if you weren't as productive at work that day, let's say you think it was because you're not a productive person. Tell me about that entire workday, and then when they tell me about the entire workday, it turns out that their boss called them out throughout the day for 5 different meetings that could have been an email. And they didn't notice that information because their world is guided by that negative schema. But then it also happens that it was impossible to be as productive as they would have liked to have been on that day because their boss was taking up so much of their time. When they realise the influence of the schema, then we can work on taking steps to change it. That's how I use it. The problem is, again, it's a reification. We can't objectively observe ideas about the world, schemas using the senses. So we have to just assume that that is a regular phenomenon that occurs in the human mind. Using scientific methodologies like the ones I described, we have tested frameworks like cognitive behaviour therapy, schema therapy, dialectical behaviour therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, motivational interviewing, a range of different types of psychotherapy. And we found that there is a significant change that occurs in people when they undertake these types of therapies, when they're conducted by a competent therapist. So we infer from that evidence, using means to minimise the bias, that when we administer the therapies, something actually does happen within the individual. We can't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear it. So we're making some assumptions, but we can safely assume that something is happening. Ebony, this is the point at which perhaps a lot of skeptics might roll their eyes somewhat, but I'd like to deliver some objective commentary. A lot of what you've described, that people describe as spiritual, even if you may not use that term, actually has a place in science as well. You mentioned that part of what drives the efficacy or the effectiveness of a particular belief system is taking action that is internally motivated. Do you believe that the objective reality of a belief system, do you think that that's less important than what it actually empowers the individual to do for themselves?
Yeah, I think that our belief systems are most effective when it does empower us to make positive change.
And science does explain that, and there are actually studies that have demonstrated that in certain populations, people who meditate, on average, might experience benefits in their life, like a sense of peace, a sense of calm, a sense of being able to focus, that similar groups who don't meditate don't experience on average. That certain people who practice religion are actually more likely than similar people who don't practice religion to experience positive gains in their life, like feeling happiness, not feeling symptoms of depression or anxiety, feeling that their life is heading in a positive direction. This is because one of the fundamental tenets of how the mind operates, which can be confronting for some because we like to think we have free will, but it thrives on structure.
Yeah.
And that's why eliminating all forms of what we consider to be objectively true would actually not be good for society, because the mind needs a framework through which it perceives the world, a set of assumptions that it holds to be true, which science also does. I've explained previously in my program that science actually does make a set of base assumptions on which knowledge is then sought. It needs a way to organise all that information that comes in. We don't actually live in a vacuum. Like, we don't just come up with ideas out of nowhere. And there are some philosophies that state that everything is subjective and that nothing is objectively true. But the fact is that the mind actually does take in information and process it, even if we're not aware of it, in a systematic way. And we need a set of assumptions in mind. Even if we're not aware of them, they're definitely there. And the mind, by its very nature, functions with assumptions. And it holds certain ideas to be true, and it organises things that way. And that's why people of a range of different belief systems, alternative spirituality, philosophy, religion, even some people who secular, each of those people of different types of groups can experience similar positive outcomes in their life, because it's not necessarily the belief system itself that dictates the outcome, it's what it actually does for you internally. The idea of being validated and that empowering people, that actually does have a neurological basis. When somebody empathizes with us, and that's why therapists use a range of active listening and empathy techniques, our mind actually responds in such a way that it is prepared to solve problems, and it calms down, which is actually, when you're undertaking a change, it's imperative that you're able to keep calm, because some of the information you discuss with a person can be distressing. So the empathy helps to activate the neurology that keeps you calm and actually primes you for problem solving. As we've discussed, one of the most fundamental experiences we can have is receiving other people's validation when we do something good, because it teaches us to have a sense of self-worth, which is necessary to have a healthy mind, and the validation can help facilitate that. All of these different beliefs that people discuss all have something in common. Because we believe so strongly in them and we're emotionally attached to them, we're encouraged to take action, and it's the action in life that actually produces the positive outcomes. So we're not that different, are we?
No, not at all. And I do think, I guess, going back to the point you made about meditation, one of the most amazing things that I come across is that they found when studying the brains of monks that they had the compassion part of the brain was larger than those that didn't practice meditation. So I started meditating at the age of 18, and I carried that through very difficult times in my life. And if I didn't have that meditation, I know for sure I would not be here today. And that practice of meditation saved me. It gave me solace, and that was going inward to my inner self, to my body, to stilling my thoughts and finding a safe place within. In terms of our belief systems, I definitely agree. Even in regards to my own belief systems, I believe in certain things that I know factually are true for me and they make sense in my world, but I'm also really open to those belief systems growing and changing as I grow and change. And I feel like that's the most important thing when it comes to whatever belief systems we have. It's not about proving the other person wrong. It's about allowing those belief systems to grow and change, allowing ourselves to adapt, but also making sure that the root of those belief systems are to benefit yourselves and benefit humanity as a whole.
Are you able to describe an example of an intuitive reading that you might conduct that would really make people's, let's say that a lot of people would find difficult to believe? I'm not saying I'm going to find difficult to believe, but
no, that's
something
okay.
that people would find difficult to believe.
I'm going to be very transparent here and say that majority of my clients are skeptics or clients that have never had a reading before. So one that really stands out to me, and I'm going to be honest, I even get blown away by what comes through, because I'm human. I doubt myself. I go into readings going, what if this comes out and it's wrong? Because as much as I believe in the work that I do, I'm still human and I've still had my own conditioning and the things that I've had to work through. So I did a reading over the phone with a lady. All I knew is her name. And obviously keep in mind, I cannot see. So there's no visual perception there. We were going through her reading, and it obviously navigated through her mental health at the time, the challenges that she was going through, touched on, it came through that she had kids. But the thing that really got me is her father came through. So I also have the ability to connect with those that have passed away. So her father came through. He was very specific. I was very specific. And he showed me that she had had multiple miscarriages and stillbirth. He also told me that he was apologizing for the disconnect and disharmony that he had created in the family dynamic, that he had cheated on the mother, and all of these other specifics that I would not know otherwise.
So she had never given you any information about her father or
No
about
information.
miscarriages?
Nothing at all. I don't ask questions. I'll sometimes say, I'm getting this piece of information. Can you confirm that? They'll say yes, or they'll say no. Most of the time, obviously, it is yes. So then I go into that. But other than that, I don't ask any questions.
I'm not trying to discredit anyone. I feel a little awkward asking it, but I am genuinely curious. We know that from science, when somebody is having a psychic experience, that their brain activation actually changes. How can we differentiate between an extrasensory experience and psychosis? Because Western science and psychology tends to conceptualize a lot of spiritual experiences and intuitive experiences as psychosis. And for the audience, if anyone who's not familiar with it, psychosis means when an individual is having experiences that aren't real by objective standards, which means that they have ideas or thoughts about the world that can't possibly be true. For example, rats are eating my brain. They might have sensory experiences like hearing, seeing, smelling, touching, or tasting physical stimuli that aren't there. That's what psychosis means. It's not a generic term for mental illness. It's a very specific type of experience.
Well, I think for my own self and in my own experience, the biggest thing that I have learnt to do through my work, because like I said, I've never had a teacher, I've never gone to any study course or workshop to learn to harness this skill. This has been all on my own accord. And the biggest thing that I've been very specific about with myself is my own grounding. And the reason why I can differentiate the difference between it being psychosis and an intuitive experience is because with psychosis, so many other things are accompanied, and my mental health is not impacted in any way, shape, or form by my readings and by my ability to intuitively connect with people. So what I mean by that is I'm very specific on how I ground myself and enter into my sessions, and how I specifically enter into a person's energy, and then how I leave that session too. So I am making sure that what's happened in that session and what I've been able to tune into is solely purposeful for that session only. And this may be controversial in the spiritualist realm, but many spiritualists believe that spirits can open and shut doors and move things. In my experience, that does not occur.
It is true statistically that when someone experiences psychosis, it tends to be a symptom of a specific mental illness that is associated with distress. In fact, one of the key defining aspects of a mental illness is that it does cause distress and an inability to function in the normative culture in which the person is situated. Mm-hmm. So for a person who has those types of experiences and can function as any other person would, and the intuition and those experiences are the only thing that differentiate them, then statistically speaking, you could say, well, I'm not in any distress and I'm not experiencing adverse effects, therefore it can't be psychosis. That is a valid argument. As a counter to that, though, even in psychology, we make an exception to certain experiences based on cultural norms. So even though spirituality and these types of practices aren't necessarily what we would call mainstream in Western society, we tend to assume that if somebody has those experiences and they're not distressing in any way, we don't consider them problematic. Is there any possibility that it's not psychosis in the definitional sense, in that psychology doesn't define it as psychosis because we assume that all psychosis is linked to distress? Like someone out there, I'm not saying you necessarily, but someone might be having these experiences that are not bad in any way, but actually represent a psychotic phenomenon, given that we have the evidence that the brain changes when someone's having a psychic experience. Is there a way for us to differentiate between those brain changes in psychosis and in an actual psychic experience, or maybe differentiate it as a type of psychosis?
Yeah, honestly, I think something that springs to mind, I've never had a psychotic experience myself. However, I have had many traumatic adverse experiences, which I have always felt like they have in many ways harnessed my ability to tune into other people's experience, because I know what it feels like to go through so many different adversities. I then am able to pick it up when somebody else is going through that. So I'm not ruling out in the science realm that it could be put down to some sort of form of psychosis, but I will say that I have seen in many instances many other people who practice this type of work that also struggle significantly with mental health. I'm going to say I don't think I've ever come across another psychic or another medium in my personal experience that actually doesn't struggle significantly with mental health. So I would have to agree with you to some extent.
I'm not even going to argue that science has the answer here, because this is something far more complex than
of course,
what us mere mortals could potentially understand in many ways. But I've noted that actually from listening to other people who have described similar experiences, that people mention that they have spiritual awakenings when they've been vulnerable, and you've now explained that you've most likely not met someone who has had these experiences without having also had struggles. And there are also records in the mental health literature, plenty of them actually, that a lot of these experiences can follow trauma. And I've helped clients themselves who have diagnosed, and again, diagnoses are a reification, so just being clear on that, of say schizophrenia, or have experienced dissociative episodes, which is where a person loses track of their ability to track time and space following trauma. And it's also been recorded, although I've never worked with a person of this description myself, of people who have dissociative identity, in which somebody actually takes on a completely different sense of self and doesn't have a memory of the other senses of self. In other words, they believe they're a completely different person. A lot of it's theorized that actually follows trauma, because the person is trying to find at an unconscious level a means of coping with living in such a dangerous world in which those traumatic experiences could happen to them. And the way they do it is by seeking peace and solace in a different sense of self. And I'm wondering if there's ever been any studies done that potentially try to differentiate the experience of psychosis following trauma and the person experiencing it positively rather than in a distressing fashion from true spiritual phenomena, because I'd be genuinely fascinated by that. I'm not sure if any scientists have dared go down that path, but I'd be fascinated by it.
Oh, I would be too. And honestly, if any scientist did dare go down that path, I would put my hand up to be studied, because I think that is something I have thought about a lot.
I was going to ask your view on some of the tricks that an unscrupulous or a fake psychic might use.
There's a few things that spring to mind as I think about that, because that is one of the reasons why, one, I will never do a public reading. I feel like the sessions that I give people are very private, they're very intimate, and they actually unpack a lot that people I don't feel like is beneficial to share with the entire world unless that person is absolutely comfortable in doing. But another example I have is when I go into these things, I'm very specific on what I say. I do specify things down to the month if I can. It's never lately. It's never around about. It's 6 to 12 months, 3 to 6 months, 2 to 6 weeks. It's very specific. And I've worked tirelessly on making sure that I can avoid using any gimmicky tricks. And I think one thing that sprung to mind when I was in the infancy of my work is I worked at this yoga retreat, and there was a group of other spiritualists that did different modalities, and I was getting a lift home from a guy, and he was a medium. He said, "Ebony, I can't believe you do the work that you do and you are blind." And I said, "What do you mean? We do the same work, do we not?" And he said, "No. When we were at school," so he went to school to study his work as a medium, he said, "we learned to read body language and to ask questions in order to get things out of people, but you do it without seeing." And I was thinking, okay, so what are you doing then? So I completely hear what you're saying, and that is something that I tirelessly work on making sure I'm not doing, because I don't want to discredit the work that I do and the purpose that it has and the importance that it serves for other people.
Perhaps one day science will be able to explain this. It's incredible nonetheless, that's for sure.
If we can take from all, I guess, walks of life and belief systems and views and kind of marry those together, we can then become more balanced. So I wanted to know, in the belief system of science-based evidence, do you feel like it limits you from connecting with people on a human level, because not everything can be quantified?
That's an excellent question, because I would say that if we perceive the world only in a quantifiable fashion, then we would practically destroy human connection. That's why I don't approach human connection in the way that I would approach science.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, when I'm connecting with somebody, I do it differently personally and professionally, but there's a certain aspect of chemistry and intuition that I use myself. Maybe it's not
Mm-hmm.
intuition in the same way that you experience it, but it's what I would call intuition, or using what I can experience but can't describe in words to
Yep.
guide how I interact with that person. I'll give an
Mm-hmm.
example. When it comes to forming relations with people, whether it be friends or whether it be a romantic partner, I don't read up on the literature or the science, quote unquote, on how to make the best impression on a date. The formula to making friends and impressing people when you're trying to make friends. I'm autistic, so when I was younger, I was taken to therapy, and people tried to guide me using quite rigid structures on how I should interact with people. But
Mm-hmm.
as I grew, as I matured, I tried these frameworks and found they didn't work. So I said, okay, I'm just going to trust myself now. So when I'm connecting with someone, I have my cautions about me. Like, I know that there are certain types of people with whom I may not be able to connect well. There's only a few specified descriptions of those people. But outside of that, I do it purely by intuition. I enter into an interaction with someone. I'll start the conversation. I'll just let it flow and see where it goes, and I'll follow it. And I just use my intuition. I don't try to quantify the formula for a perfect interaction with someone, because that is, to me, guaranteed to destroy the interaction. I just want to feel it. Professionally, when I'm connecting with a client, again, a lot of what I see therapists doing I don't agree with regard to how they present themselves in therapy. Yes, I agree there have to be professional boundaries, and I certainly have mine. But when I'm connecting with someone, I know what techniques tend to help someone feel comfortable, but outside of them, I try to connect on a human level by not getting rid of aspects such as humour, if it's appropriate to use humour, or self-disclosure. I don't do a lot of that in therapy, but people know me in my podcast and in the information on my life coaching services that I am openly a mentally ill individual. That has actually allowed me to develop the approaches that I use. I'm presenting as a human who's confident in what he does and quite happy to enter into a discussion with someone.
Even though our intuitions may vary in the ways that we use it, I use my intuition in the same way too, to check the vibe of an individual and follow a conversation and follow that instinctual feeling on how it's going. And you kind of, I feel like we've all had those experiences where we've met people, and without us even verbalizing, we can get a vibe on a person. We know whether there's something a little bit off about them, or there's something that we really connect with for them. I did have a question regarding your diagnosis of autism. Do you feel like there are a lot of people who have ASD that find more structure and confirmation in science-based evidence?
One of the characteristics of autism is comfort in structure and comfort in a sense of predictability, and science provides a sense of predictability by providing evidence that they can test. I'm not sure statistically how common it is, I'll be honest. I know that it's one of the marking characteristics. So I assume a lot of people in the autistic community do have that quality. However, we are actually, regardless of how we divide ourselves, we are more alike than we are different.
Yes.
So I think, yes, that certainly is a quality of autism, but I'm sure there are plenty of autistic people that do prefer to use their intuition and have a relatively normal balance between structure and spontaneity.
How do you find that balance between spontaneity and the structure that science provides? How do you check yourself when you feel like you're leaning too much on, I guess, the structure of science, and how do you bring yourself back to that balance?
Well, that's a good question. When I was younger, I was probably more made anxious by uncertainty. As an adult, I've essentially overcome most of that. But what I essentially do, funnily enough, is intuition. The intuition itself actually guides me as to where I should use structure and where I should use intuition. And it's all qualitative judgment. And I'll give an example. The way that I run my life is very heavily based on routine, but it's based on routine in which the routine doesn't risk the outcome. So, for example, in the way that I conduct my housework, it's very routine based. In the way that I structure my meals and my eating habits, it's very routine based. My exercise, very routine based. My work is relatively routine based, although I have to be adaptable in that. But I have a routine for when I'm conducting certain aspects of my work. If there comes a situation where I have to change that routine at a moment's notice, I get no anxiety from it. And when it comes to circumstances where the routine would actually inhibit the outcome, like socializing, for example, where I just want to have fun with someone and connect on a human level, I know in those circumstances from experience and intuition, if I try and stick to a routine here, it's not going to do anything for the interaction. So I let go of routine and I go to spontaneity. I have a sense of order, but the order is just sitting in the background so that if anything unexpected happens, I can take control of the situation and make sure that nobody gets hurt. It's essentially qualitative judgment on when routine is good and that there's no better alternative, or where routine is actually inhibitory. One needs life experience in order to come to those conclusions. You need practice in life, much like you need practice to master any other skill. Living itself is a set of skills, and you master them by practicing.
Obviously, I don't have autism, but I do have an extensive trauma history, and there can be a lot of overlapping symptoms with, autism and CPTSD, which I do have. And so structure is a big thing for me, and something that I've had to learn is the exact same thing as you in terms of following my intuition, because structuring my day makes me feel safe. And it minimizes the anxiety, but then learning when structure is not going to work and when I have to just flow. So I definitely relate to you regarding that. I did have one more question just about anything that you may implement in your life that may be more on the spiritualist realm. Like, have you ever implemented any manifestation or meditation? Have you ever found any of these practices helpful, beneficial for you and your clients?
Can you briefly describe what manifestation is? Because I know this term is used quite broadly and different people interpret it differently.
So manifestation involves visualizing and embodying what you're wanting for yourself. I'm going to take it back to my own personal experience. I grew up in a very complex experience, and I had a lot of trauma and a lot of adversity. Manifestation became a big part of that. And what I mean by that is I would start visualizing how I would want to feel, how I would want my life to be, how I would want things to change. And I feel like through visualizing those things, through repeating affirmations, I'm more of a visualizer though. I was able to then take the actions in order to allow those things.
Well, as it happens, I was actually going to mention this earlier. Manifestation actually does have a scientific basis. I wouldn't necessarily argue that it's exclusively spiritual. I do manifest, but I don't call it manifesting. I actually call it planning, which might sound a little pedantic, but the science says that the mind is driven by goals and structure. Manifestation in psychology is really knowing what you want the outcome to be and then consciously taking action to make it happen. And the envisioning and spiritual aspects of manifestation as a spiritual practice, the way that psychology explains it is when you think positive thoughts, you unconsciously influence the quality of the actions. Having quality actions then reinforces the positive thoughts, which motivates you to do more positive actions. It happens at an unconscious level, but that's basically what's happening. And so if that's what we mean by manifesting, I manifest all the time. Yes. But it's a planning. For me, it's a planning framework. I know what I want. I normally know what I want a particular outcome to look like. And then I consciously ask myself, what do I need to do right now that's going to bring me one step closer to it? And then once I've done that, okay, what's the next step? Often something that I do is understanding that my thoughts don't just influence my actions, but my actions influence my thoughts. So, for example, one of my passions is music, and I play guitar. And when I'm playing and I don't feel like the quality of my playing on that day is where I want it to be, I just tell myself to keep playing. And regardless of how I feel about it, I keep playing, because if I keep playing over a number of days in which I don't feel my guitar playing is where I want it to be, eventually all that practice, unbeknownst to me, is going to add up into fine-tuning my skills. And then one day I'm going to start playing and all of a sudden I'm going to be better than I imagined. But that has a neurological basis. I'm actually practicing the physical skill and the psychological skill of playing music, that even if I'm not aware of what it's doing for me, it still has an effect on me.
Where I do think the flaws can be in, I guess, a spiritualist perspective of manifestation, not my personal perspective, but many other spiritualists that I've interacted with in terms of manifestation, is they often see it as something outside of you. So they often see it as setting your intentions, thinking positive thoughts, doing some positive actions, but that the universe will just automatically provide. Whereas for me, my perspective on manifestation or planning is in alignment with yours. I feel like it is as much as setting your intentions and figuring out how you can take one step closer to what it is, to your desired outcome, whilst also continuing to take those steps even when you feel like you don't want to take those steps.
You do influence your own actions. So if we conceptualize manifestation as partaking in any type of ritual that actually has a neurological, psychological effect on the way you live your life that results in a benefit, then yeah, it's absolutely evidence-based. It absolutely works.
And have you ever tried meditation for yourself?
Not meditation. I have used mindfulness techniques to cope with trauma and trauma symptoms. It certainly does help. I found that I'm actually able to reduce the intensity of anxiety that I might experience using even something as simple as breathing techniques, which is also to say that breath work is not just a spiritual practice. Well, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the way you breathe influences your psychological state. So good breathing is absolutely essential. Well, Ebony, this has been an incredible conversation. I have to say that we both stepped out of our comfort zone in some way, and I'm so glad that we did.
No, I 100% agree, and I'm so grateful for not only your time but your willingness to be open, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I think having a healthy and constructive debate and discussing different belief systems, it can often cause so much conflict, but when you can do it in a mindful and, in tuned way and compassionate way, I feel like you can learn something. I learned so much from this conversation, so thank you.
And likewise, Ebony, thank you. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today. As per usual, if you do have any concerns about your own well-being, please seek help from a professional immediately. It's never too late. And also, we'd love to hear from you. If you have thoughts of your own, whether it's on something we've discussed or otherwise, please get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. So until next time, take care.
Thank you.